Throughout history, there's been one problem that crushed more empires than any enemy ever could. It wasn't lost battles. It wasn't weak leaders or poor strategy. It was something far simpler and far more devastating: the inability to keep paying soldiers. When the money stopped, loyalty vanished overnight. Empires didn't crumble because they were defeated. They crumbled because they went broke. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where we uncover the money truths that shaped our world. Nothing is ever as simple as it seems, and today's story will change how you see power forever. Think about this for a moment. Before modern banks, before taxes as we know them, before governments could borrow money easily, every empire faced the same brutal reality. How do you keep paying hundreds of thousands of armed soldiers year after year without fail? Soldiers don't fight for glory alone. They fight because they expect something concrete in return: food for their families, a piece of land, cold, hard payment. Once armies stopped being temporary volunteers and became permanent institutions, war transformed into a massive payroll problem. And here's the thing: ancient governments couldn't just print money when they needed it. They couldn't run up endless debts. If the treasury went empty, that was it. No backup plan. No emergency loans. Which meant every empire had to base its military power on something real and tangible: silver dug from mines, land seized through conquest, labor forced from conquered people. This wasn't some abstract economic theory. This was the foundation of civilization itself. No empire understood this reality better than Rome, and no empire pushed the system harder. At its peak, Rome commanded roughly 400,000 soldiers scattered across 3 continents. That wasn't just a fighting force. That was a permanent institution requiring constant funding. Every single soldier expected regular pay, benefits, and often land when they retired. This wasn't Rome being generous. This was the absolute minimum cost of holding the empire together. Rome's borders didn't stay secure because soldiers loved Rome. They stayed secure because soldiers were paid reliably, at least in the beginning. The engine that powered all of this was silver, real, physical silver. The denarius, Rome's standard silver coin, became the backbone of imperial power. Soldiers received their wages in silver coins. Taxes were collected in silver. Trade depended on it. Rome's authority was literally stamped onto each piece of metal. But here's what most people don't realize: silver doesn't magically appear. Rome needed massive quantities of it constantly, and that need quietly determined where the empire would expand next. When Rome conquered Spain, it wasn't just about military glory or securing borders. It was about gaining access to some of the richest silver mines in the entire known world. Rome literally dug its army's wages out of Spanish mountains. As long as silver kept flowing from those mines, the system worked beautifully. Soldiers trusted their paychecks. Merchants accepted Roman coins without question. Taxes moved smoothly through the empire. The army maintained order and protected trade routes, ensuring silver kept circulating back to the government. It was a perfect loop of power, money, and military force reinforcing each other. But here's where things get interesting, and here's where every empire eventually hits the same wall. Silver mines don't last forever. By the 2nd century, Rome had exhausted the easy silver deposits. Mining became more expensive and more difficult. Meanwhile, military campaigns grew costlier. The empire's borders kept expanding faster than its ability to pay for them. And instead of facing this fundamental problem honestly, Roman leaders made a choice that would echo through history. They started cheating. The coins still looked the same. They still had the emperor's face stamped on them. They still carried Rome's authority. But slowly, quietly, the government reduced the silver content. A little copper mixed in here, a little more alloy there. On paper, soldiers were still receiving the same wage. In reality, their money bought less and less with each passing year. At first, nobody really noticed the change. Then prices started creeping upward. Merchants began demanding more coins for the same products. Soldiers complained that their pay didn't stretch as far as it used to. So what did the government do? They raised wages using even more debased coins with less silver, which pushed prices even higher, which forced the government to raise taxes on everyone else, which squeezed farmers and workers who had no way to demand higher income. Inflation didn't announce itself as a crisis. It crept in through a series of small compromises. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. Each seemed necessary. But together, they hollowed out the entire system from the inside. The Roman army caught on faster than regular citizens did. Soldiers began demanding cash bonuses on top of regular pay. Emperors who couldn't deliver these bonuses were overthrown, sometimes violently, and replaced by generals who promised better compensation. Loyalty shifted away from Rome itself and toward whoever controlled the treasury at any given moment. The military stopped serving the state. Instead, the state began serving the military, and the people who paid the real price for all of this had absolutely no voice in the matter. Farmers faced increasingly aggressive tax collection. Trade became unpredictable and risky. Savings lost their value. Confidence in Roman currency eroded. What started as a clever workaround to a resource shortage became a massive, slow-motion transfer of wealth from ordinary people to the armed forces. There's a deep irony in what happened to Rome. The empire didn't fall because it abandoned silver. It fell because it depended on silver too completely. When the metal stopped flowing from the mines, the entire illusion of stability collapsed. By the 3rd century, the denarius was basically just copper with a thin coating. Soldiers were no longer paid reliably in money at all. Instead, they received food rations and promises of land. The economy fragmented into regional pieces. Trust evaporated. And the empire that once conquered the Mediterranean with silver coins began tearing itself apart under the weight of its own payroll. If there were an award for financial denial, Rome would still be winning it today. But here's the crucial point. Rome wasn't unique. It was simply one of the earliest empires to face this problem on a massive scale. The pattern Rome revealed would repeat itself throughout history, in different places, under different flags, with the same devastating consequences. Because once you understand how an empire pays its army, you understand who really holds power. And once that payment system starts breaking down, collapse isn't a question of if. It's only a question of when. When Rome's silver system started failing, it didn't invent some revolutionary new solution. Instead, it fell back on something older, more primitive, and far less stable: land, plunder, and promises of future rewards. And in doing so, Rome revealed a truth that every empire eventually learns through bitter experience. If you can't pay your army with money, you pay them with constant expansion. But expansion never lasts forever. Long before Rome faced this dilemma, other empires had already built their entire military systems around this principle. The Assyrian Empire is one of the clearest and earliest examples. Its army was feared throughout the ancient world, not just for its effectiveness, but for its brutal purpose. Assyrian soldiers weren't paid regular salaries. They were paid through conquest itself. Plunder from defeated cities, captives to enslave, land to distribute. Cities that resisted weren't simply defeated in battle. They were systematically stripped of resources, their populations deported, and their territories reorganized to feed the Assyrian war machine. This wasn't random cruelty or excessive violence. This was deliberate economic design. The Assyrian state didn't need a complex monetary system because war funded itself. Each successful campaign replenished the army's resources, rewarded loyalty, and reinforced the terror that made future conquests easier. Violence wasn't a side effect of the system. Violence was the system. But there was an obvious catch. When expansion slowed down or stopped, the entire incentive structure collapsed. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to being rewarded through conquest had zero patience for peace or restraint. And when the empire could no longer feed its army through continuous victory, It was consumed by rebellion, fragmentation, and internal collapse within just a few generations. The same basic logic appeared centuries later in the early Islamic caliphates, though in a more sophisticated and structured form. Soldiers were paid through government stipends funded by taxes imposed on conquered territories, land taxes, trade levies, and religiously defined obligations flowed back to the central government, where they were redistributed to the military elite. As long as the empire kept expanding, revenue kept growing. As long as revenue grew, soldiers remained loyal. But when borders stabilized and conquest slowed, the system immediately began to strain. Administrative costs rose, tax burdens on conquered populations deepened, and the political unity that constant expansion had masked began to fracture. Growth wasn't just encouraged in this system. Growth was absolutely required for survival. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, China was developing a completely different solution, one that relied less on precious metals or plunder and more on massive social organization. Under the Han Dynasty, the state maintained enormous armies without depending heavily on coinage at all. Instead, it mobilized society itself as the funding mechanism. Taxes weren't paid only in money. They were paid in grain, in cloth, and in forced labor. Peasants were required to serve periods of compulsory work, building roads, stocking government granaries, transporting military supplies, supporting the logistics of distant campaigns. Soldiers were fed directly from state-controlled warehouses. Military campaigns were planned around supply lines rather than treasure chests. The system was remarkably efficient, highly centralized, and incredibly resilient. But it came at a human cost that rarely appears in the heroic histories. Entire populations lived under permanent obligation to sustain an army. They would never join and defend a frontier they would never see. It worked because the Chinese state had the administrative power and organizational capacity to enforce it across vast distances. But when that centralized power weakened, the system unraveled just as surely as Rome's silver economy did. And then there were empires that paid their armies not with money, not with land, not with grain, but with people. The Aztec Empire had no standing salaried army in any modern sense. Warriors fought for social status, for honor, and for the right to extract tribute from conquered peoples. Conquered cities were forced to deliver food, textiles, raw materials, and human captives on a rigid schedule. These regular payments sustained the capital and rewarded the military class that enforced the system through constant threat of violence. This wasn't chaotic or disorganized. It was highly bureaucratic. Tribute lists were meticulously recorded by government scribes. Military campaigns were organized specifically to maintain fear and compliance rather than to expand territory continuously. The army functioned simultaneously as both military enforcer and tax collector. But this system was incredibly brittle. It had no flexibility, no buffer, no backup plan. When tribute stopped flowing for any reason, the entire political structure collapsed almost instantly. The empire had no financial reserves, no surplus mechanism, no way to adapt when the extraction system failed. When the Spanish arrived, the system shattered in months. Different civilizations, different tools and methods, different contexts and cultures. But the same underlying truth runs through all of them. Armies are never paid in abstractions or promises. They're paid with something real and tangible: precious metal, land, forced labor, or human lives. And whatever that something is, whatever resource forms the basis of military payment, ends up shaping the entire society built on top of it. The method of paying soldiers determines how empires expand, how they govern, who suffers, and how they eventually fall. This is where studying the past starts to feel uncomfortably familiar and relevant to our present moment. Modern states like to believe they've solved this ancient problem. Today, armies are paid through government budgets, through bonds, through complex balance sheets. Salaries arrive through digital transfers. Military equipment is financed through long-term contracts and procurement systems. Wars are funded through government deficits instead of through direct conquest and plunder. We tell ourselves the system is completely different now, but strip away the modern financial language and the underlying structure hasn't changed nearly as much as we'd like to believe. Military spending is still treated as essentially untouchable in national budgets. When government budgets get tight, social programs are debated, cut, and negotiated. Defense budgets are protected and often increased. Inflation still quietly shifts the cost of military spending onto the general population without most people realizing it's happening. Debt replaces tribute. Central banks replace silver mines. And the burden still falls disproportionately on people who never voted on the system that governs their lives. The tools and mechanisms evolved and became more sophisticated, but the fundamental logic didn't change at all. Inflation today functions exactly the same way coin debasement did in ancient Rome. It allows modern states to meet their obligations, especially military obligations, without openly and honestly raising taxes on voters. It transfers purchasing power away from savers and wage earners toward government priorities, and it disproportionately protects and benefits those closest to the source of money creation, just as coin debasement benefited those closest to the Roman mint. Nothing says stable, sustainable system quite like needing invisible, poorly understood mechanisms to fund the most visible and expensive force on Earth. The most dangerous illusion facing us isn't that history repeats itself in exact detail. It's that we believe we've somehow outgrown these ancient patterns, that we've evolved beyond them, that our sophisticated financial systems make us immune to the forces that destroyed every previous empire. But the truth is simpler and harsher. Empires don't fall because they lose wars on battlefields. They fall because the systems that pay for military force become economically unsustainable. When the cost of maintaining power exceeds society's ability to bear that cost, collapse doesn't arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrives as gradual erosion. Trust erodes first, then economic stability, then social cohesion, then political legitimacy. The pattern plays out over decades, sometimes over generations, but it plays out with remarkable consistency. This is exactly why understanding economic history isn't just academic curiosity or intellectual entertainment. It's practical financial self-defense for your own life. Because if you don't understand how money naturally flows toward power in any system, if you don't see clearly who gets paid first and who bears the cost when systems come under strain, and if you don't recognize inflation, government debt, and resource extraction for exactly what they are, then history doesn't need to repeat itself in obvious ways. It will simply move forward in new forms, and you'll feel the consequences in your own life without ever seeing or understanding the cause. If this gave you a completely new perspective on how power really works, hit that subscribe button right now. History has all the answers we need. I'm here to show you exactly where to look, because the empires that ignored these patterns are dust. The people who understand them have a fighting chance.